Dr. Lee, on September 18th, the Asian Development Bank revised its April forecast of the Asian economy. What was the biggest change and why was it made?
In April this year, many forecasters predicted that the world economy would recover strongly in the second half of this year. We are now in the middle of the second half, however, with a little sign of strong recovery. On the contrary, increasing uncertainties are pressing down the confidence of consumers and investors worldwide. It is now widely expected that the speed of economic recovery in the industrialized world will be slower than it was expected several months ago. We revised our April forecast to reflect this changing global economic environment. There are significant changes in our updated forecast if we look at individual country numbers. However, the most important finding for the developing Asia as a whole is the fact that the Asian economies have been surprisingly resilient despite the sluggish global economy. Consequently, the average growth rate of developing Asia has been adjusted upwards in our update. Now, developing Asia is projected to grow by 5% this year as against 3.7% last year. Strong domestic demand and recovery in exports contributed to this resilience.
I see. Now, looking forward, what's in store for the rest of the year? Can you tell us what the prospects are and what the reasons are for economic growth in countries like India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan in the South Asian region?
Although developing Asia as a whole is expected to show acceleration in its economic growth, South Asian countries are not so lucky. The average economic growth rate for South Asia, including Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, is projected at 3.9% this year, lower than last year's growth rate, and also lower than our April forecast for this year. The main reasons for these decelerations are abnormal weather conditions that adversely affected agricultural production, weaker global demand for South Asian exports, and security concerns surrounding the region. In 2003, however, the region's performance should improve with the expectation of mild global recovery and more normal weather conditions. Speaking about Afghanistan, reliable economic data are hard to collect, so we did not include Afghanistan in our update. However, our internal information indicates that the country may experience a sharp rebound in its economic growth in 2002 and 2003, perhaps by 10% per annum or more, thanks to the increasing foreign assistance and revitalization of private sector activities.
Next, can you tell us what you see happening in Southeast Asia, mainly in the ASEAN countries? Are there any trends we should be paying attention to in this area?
This year's GDP forecast for Southeast Asian countries was revised upwards slightly in our update. Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam will register a high growth rate of over 5%, while Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand will show relatively slower growth. In 2003, however, most Southeast Asian countries are expected to perform much better. Both exports and domestic demand are contributing to their economic growth. Export growth will recover from the setback of last year when exports contracted by almost 10%. At the same time, domestic demand will be helped by expansionary fiscal and monetary policies. The biggest risk on the horizon is the prospect of a deceleration in the U.S. economy that would translate into lower Southeast Asian exports. Another concern is low private investment in some Southeast Asian countries because of excess capacity and systemic financial sector problems. In these countries, unless in-depth financial sector reforms and corporate restructuring are undertaken, a sustainable recovery will be difficult to achieve.
I see. Now, how about Taiwan and China? They're fairly new to the WTO. What are their economic prospects?
Yes, Taiwan and China joined the WTO less than a year ago, and they are in the process of adjusting their economies to new environment. Our updated forecast shows that the economic performance and prospects of China and Taiwan are quite different. Last year, China grew by 7.3%, while Taiwan experienced a negative growth. This year, China is expected to grow by over 7% again, compared to 3% growth projected for Taiwan. A major difference in the engine of growth between China and Taiwan is their investment. This year, China's fixed investment is projected to grow by a double-digit number, while Taiwan is likely to experience negative or zero growth in its fixed investment. The sharp rise in fixed investment in China is attributable largely to increased government expenditure and foreign direct investment, but there is also a sign that capital spending by private sector is increasing. On the contrary, weak investment demand in Taiwan partly reflects Taiwanese investment going to mainland China to take advantage of low labor costs and big market there. Although China is enjoying an excellent economic performance today, if China wants to sustain high economic growth in the medium and long term, there is not much room for comfort. There are serious concerns to be addressed sooner than later. One such concern is the huge amount of non-performing loans in the banking sector. The other concern is the large income and social gap between coastal region and western hinterland.
And what are your prospects for East Asian countries like South Korea and Japan?
Korea is expected to grow by 6% this year, much higher than our April estimate of 4.8%. Strong growth in consumption and modest growth in investment and exports are contributing to the better than expected growth in Korea. In particular, the strong growth in consumption has been fueled partly by the government's expansionary monetary policy and partly by the changes in the operational strategy of banking institutions, focusing increasingly on consumer lending. This has the significant boosting impact on private consumption. Speaking about Japan, I'm afraid to say that we did not include our own forecast for Japanese economy in our update because our forecast cover only developing countries in the Asia-Pacific region. However, based on the forecast made by other institutions, we did assume that the Japanese economy will show a small negative or zero growth this year and a mild recovery next year. I would like to take this opportunity to add that Japan is a very important trading and investment partner of Asia-Pacific countries and most important donor country for developing Asia. We sincerely hope that Japan will soon make good progress in its structural reforms and emerge again as an economic leader of the region.
Dr. Lee, so far we've asked you about the individual countries' prospects, but lastly, how do you think the Asian economy as a whole will perform next year in 2003?
Although developing Asia is projected to show acceleration in its growth rate this year, despite the sluggish global economy, the Asian recovery may not be sustainable if global economy remains stagnant. Substantial progress of globalization in Asia implies that the economic prospects for developing Asia will depend very much on the future course of global economy. The future course of global economy will in turn be subject to several important risks. For example, there is a risk that consumers in the United States may start to reduce their spending. In this case, the Asian exports will be affected significantly. A related risk is that industrialized economies could be mired in the long-term deflation and recession as a result of burst of bubbles in their asset prices. Also, we cannot exclude the possibility of the war against Iraq, which may cause a sharp rise in oil prices. Our updated forecast assumed that there would be no prolonged war with Iraq and that industrial economies would continue to grow, although at a reduced speed. Under these assumptions, developing Asia is expected to grow by 5.7% next year, as against 5% projected for this year. In our assessment, this scenario is plausible, but I must add that downside risk is also high due to increasing uncertainties in the global scene.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Lee.
Thank you.